everyone. If you're here for today's webinar on return to work strategies for brewers, distillers, and winemakers, you're in the right spot. We're looking forward to an interesting discussion today. My name is Dan Deacon. I'm joined here by my colleague, Eric Kahn. So the whole concept here, we did one of these webinars about a month and a half ago for brewers, distillers, and winemakers on how to handle COVID-19 and how it's going to impact your business and a lot of the changes that were coming down the pike. And now, as we're getting into summer and businesses are reopening, we're getting into new phases in both Maryland, DC, and Virginia. A lot of your businesses are able to reopen in some capacity. Either outdoor dining, indoor dining is opening or has opened in some jurisdictions, and we're going to get into all of that today. So we thought now is the perfect time to provide this return to work strategies webinar, as there's been a lot of changes both on the employment law side and safety and health side, and that's what Eric and I both specialize in. So just as quick introductions, I'm Dan Deacon. I'm an associate in Confidentiality Carey's Washington, D.C. office, and as I said, I specialize in both labor and employment and OSHA, so I work in both the L&E group and the workplace safety practice group. I represent employers during inspections and investigations conducted by federal and state OSHA, and I advise and counsel employers on a wide range of employment law issues, from discrimination, wage and hour, leave laws, and I'm heavily involved in drafting and reviewing employee handbooks, workplace safety policies, and the like. And I'll turn it over to Eric to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm one of the founding partners at Confidentiality, and I chair the firm's national OSHA practice group. I looked up this year, sort of startled to discover I've been doing this for 20 years now, exclusively in the field of workplace safety and health. The first half of my career, I practiced alongside the former first general counsel of the Osha Review Commission at a large law firm. About 10 years ago, I moved over to a big employment law firm and started an OSHA practice, built up a great team of workplace safety and health law experts around me. And 5 years ago, or actually almost 6 years ago now, we started our own firm, started Confidentiality, to specialize in those workplace safety issues with a supplemental labor and employment practice as well. Over those 20 years, I've worked with employers across all industries and providing sort of every imaginable workplace safety and health legal service, from helping develop compliant programs, auditing, training, to the reactive side of workplace safety and health, managing inspections, investigations of serious incidents and accidents, inspections by the agencies for enforcement actions, and then the full litigation practice, defending against OSHA citations and criminal prosecutions under the OSHA Act. And then recently, I thought that being an OSHA lawyer was about as specialized as one could be, but the last 4 months, I've become even more specialized. I'm a COVID-19 OSHA lawyer. That's been more or less been all we've done. I'm sure more or less all you've been thinking about and dealing with, and the challenges you've been grappling with have involved this pandemic. But we have been working with essential businesses and now businesses that are resuming and reopening to help build compliant COVID-19 exposure control and response plans, and now really starting to manage the enforcement side of the issue, where OSHA is back in the enforcement business and looking both at COVID-19 compliance. Are you doing enough to protect your employees from this new hazard in the workplace, to also run-of-the-mill compliance issues where OSHA had sort of been in hiding to protect their own workforce? They're back out there doing inspections now. So it's been an interesting few months, and we're happy today to share some insight about what we've been experiencing on the COVID-19 side of workplace safety and health and labor and employment law. So thanks for joining us.
So just really quick, going over kind of the four main elements of what we're going to be covering in today's program. We're going to first talk about some initial employment issues and employment law considerations that you want to be looking at when you're reopening or revamping, or resuming, I should say, somewhat normal business operations. Second, we're going to be going over the Osha implications of COVID-19 and some of the exposure control plan concepts that a lot of these states that we're going to be discussing today, Maryland, DC, and Virginia, have been implementing in their phased rollouts of reopenings. Third, we're going to go over those exposure control plans and response plans in detail, give you the elements and some good best practices that you should be implementing while opening, reopening, or resuming business operations. And then finally, we're going to get into some of the specifics, the reopening updates and requirements that have been laid out in DC, Maryland, and Virginia orders and the reopening plans. So with that, we'll get into the main topics. So first up is the initial employment law issues upon reopening. And we're going to start with some employment considerations and questions that you should be asking yourself when rehiring or recalling staff. 2-3 months ago, there was a time when you probably had to lay off or reduce your work staff in some capacity, whether it was laying them off, reducing their hours. So when we're reopening, what should you do? You're going to be bringing employees back. You're able to open outdoor seating to the extent that you're able to. You're able to now begin indoor seating in most of the jurisdictions, with the exception of DC and some localities. However, that is changing. DC's phase 2 is expected to begin this Monday, June 22nd. So we'll be talking about that a little later. But the first thing that you should be asking yourself is, how many employees should I recall? Is it some or all? And this is really just a tough analysis to make at this point, depending on the capacity of your business and how many patrons you'll be able to sit. And really, it's going to be flushing it out at the start to see what the demand is. I imagine going forward right now, there is going to be a demand for people want to get out. They want to go to your tasting room or sit in your outdoor patio. But again, we need to keep in mind that they want to do so in a safe manner. So we're going to talk about how you do that when we get to the Osha piece. The second employment law consideration is, does each employee need to be in the same position and or with the same pay? So really here we're talking about an exempt, non-exempt issue, and this is a question that's come up often with a lot of employers throughout these past couple months. For example, if you have a management employee who is no longer managing employees or doing management operations. For example, if you had a management employee who's now basically a server, do they meet the duties test under the FLSA exemption? And that's something that a lot of employers have been having to revisit with the change in their business models and how things are going. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Please make sure that you're considering the FLSA exemptions. And if you need to reclassify employees during this time, you should certainly do so. So third, what if you recall someone and they don't want to come back due to safety concerns? Do they get employment? So this is something that we've seen over the past few months. Someone that may have an underlying condition does not want to come back to work. And this is a sensitive subject. It implicates some ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act considerations, and we're going to touch on that in more detail on the next slide. So are the positions the same, job titles officially the same? Again, this gets back to the exempt versus non-exempt issue and reclassifying employees. Make sure if you're bringing employees back and they're classified as an exempt employee, if they have managerial responsibilities, make sure that they still have those responsibilities and they're satisfying that FLSA exemption. And then, do you need to provide new hire forms? This is a local requirement, particularly in DC. If you're rehiring someone, do you need to provide those new hire forms? So to the extent that someone was no longer on the payroll and they were furloughed, let go, they were claiming unemployment, and you are now rehiring them, you should certainly be executing those new hire forms. Next, we're going to talk about how you recall employees, and this is just a basic reminder that you need to do so in a neutral manner, non-discriminatory manner. You really need to balance the fairness and health issues piece. And here we're talking about kind of subtle biases of, oh, well, we've heard in the news that COVID-19 doesn't affect younger people as much as it does older people, or older folks are at a higher risk. Don't let that narrative influence your decision on recalling employees. That can lead to an array of issues. I mean, we're talking about potential age discrimination or disability discrimination. Really, you want to recall employees in a legitimate, non-discriminatory manner and have transparency when you're doing so. So have a rational basis for rehiring each employee, and make sure, like I said, that it's done so on a non-discriminatory basis. Getting into the ADA piece here, so there are certain employees, there are certain members of the public out there that have underlying conditions that make them more susceptible to COVID-19, and they are in a higher risk pool. And those employees may be a little bit more reluctant to return to work, and certainly returning to work in their normal capacity, perhaps. So when we're talking about ADA and these concerns, as an employee comes to you and they bring their concern about their underlying health condition and the potential impact of returning to work in your brewery, distillery, winery, this is something that you want to take serious. You want to have a conversation with them. You want to go through the interactive process, that's the legal term under the ADA, and see if you can provide them some kind of reasonable accommodation. The fear itself of getting COVID-19 is not a disability in and of itself, but if someone does have an underlying disability, if it is a qualified individual with a disability under the ADA, that is something that you need to consider, and you may need to provide them a reasonable accommodation. So an example that you see on the screen here is a worker with an underlying condition may ask that she be allowed to work or perform work activities that do not involve interacting with the public or even coworkers. So that could be a potential accommodation. Again, there's more to that analysis. Is it an undue burden? Can they perform the essential functions of their job with or without a reasonable accommodation? You have to go through that entire analysis, but initially you want to go through that interactive process and have that discussion and make sure you're doing so in good faith. So now we're going to touch and give you a reminder on the emergency paid sick and family leave law under the FSCRA. And this was something we touched on during our last webinar that we did for Brewers, Distillers, and Winemakers, but this is very important and something that we think is worth a reminder because it is here to stay for now. So employers, you really need to familiarize yourself with this law if you haven't done so. We've gotten loads of questions about this from other clients, other employers, and we have a load of FAQs on our website that you can go to for additional information, or feel free to reach out to us, but we're just going to give you the nuts and bolts here right now. So what the FSCRA does is it has two provisions, one for paid sick leave and one for paid family leave. It provides these benefits to employees of employers with fewer than 500 employees. So there is an exception for employers with 50 or fewer employees. They may be exempt from the law, and that a lot of you may find yourself in that bucket. However, there are certain circumstances that you have to meet in order to satisfy that exception, and you have to proactively demonstrate that in the first instance. So we'll get into that. So what type of benefits are provided? First, we're going to talk here about the paid sick leave benefits. So you're permitted to use the paid sick leave under the 6 bullets that you see on the screen here. If an employee is subject to quarantine or isolation, orders related to COVID-19, they're advised to self-quarantine, they obtain a diagnosis or caring for symptoms of COVID-19, they're caring for or assisting a family member, they're caring for a child whose school or daycare has closed, or they're experiencing any other substantially similar condition as defined by other health agencies. So as for the paid sick leave benefits, full-time employees are entitled to 2 weeks, up to 80 hours of paid sick leave. Part-time employees, of course, are entitled to the average number of hours worked over that 2-week period. And the pay rate is dependent on the reason for the leave. So the first 3 reasons that you see on the screen there, the employee is going to be paid at their regular rate. So 100%, but it's not to exceed $511 per day. And the other 3 remaining reasons, the last 3 bullets at the top of the screen there, it is that paid sick leave is provided at 2/3 pay, not to exceed $200 a day. So moving on into the second part of the FFCRA benefits, that's the paid family leave benefits. And what that does is it provides 12 weeks of paid FMLA leave. The first, the first 10 days may be unpaid, though employees must be permitted to use other paid leave during that time if they choose to do so. So what can they potentially use? Well, they can use the paid sick leave benefits provided under FFCRA in the first instance. So employees are eligible if they worked for the employer for at least 30 calendar days. After the first 10 days, you're going to need to compensate those employees at a rate of at least 2/3 their regular rate. And you are allowed to use these paid family leave benefits to care for a child whose school or daycare has closed due to COVID-19. So in terms of restoration of employees, if they're using any of these benefits under the FFCRA, the employee must be restored to his or her position or an equivalent position. Again, there's an exception for employers with less than 25 employees. If it causes basically an undue burden and it wouldn't be viable for the business to provide these benefits or restore the employee, that's really the analysis you need to go through. Is it an undue burden? Is it sustainable for the business to be providing these? So what you do receive, though, in providing these benefits is a dollar-for-dollar reimbursement through tax credits. So you want to make sure that you're documenting this paid sick leave under the FFCRA or the paid family leave benefits, and make sure that you have appropriate records. So there's IRS forms and instruction about what you should be doing and what kind of records you should be maintaining. And really, you're going to want to have information from the employee regarding, their name, address, reason for going out on leave, and a certification that they need to exercise their rights under these laws. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric to go over and begin some of the OSHA implications.
Thanks, Dan. Let's jump right in and see what we got on the first slide. One of the things that we want to talk about from the OSHA standpoint is that there, at the moment, is not a standard. There's not a regulation that would cover COVID-19 specifically, or even airborne infectious diseases, either in the federal OSHA scheme, under VOSH, Virginia OSHA, or Maryland OSHA. Virginia OSHA is in the process of developing an emergency temporary standard for infectious diseases, and Dan's going to talk about that a little bit later. But other than that, California, I think, is the only state out there that prior to the pandemic and including through today has a standard that would cover exposure to an airborne infectious disease like this. And so the context for analyzing compliance as opposed to just analyzing good practice and thinking about potential exposure to tort liability, when thinking about it from an OSHA regulatory standpoint, the framework is the General Duty Clause. And the General Duty Clause is that catch-all provision of the OSHA Act that requires employers to provide a workplace that's free of recognized serious hazards. And you do the analysis under the general duty clause of looking at, A, is the hazard recognized? And I think there's sort of no question at this point that there is a recognized hazard of transmission of this pandemic virus everywhere, not just workplaces, but everywhere and anywhere. So it's recognized, it's serious, and serious doesn't necessarily account for probability. And sort of every day we learn about different rates of infection and different rates of mortality. But I think regardless, there is enough very serious infections and enough individuals around the world who have died from the illness that I think OSHA would easily clear that barrier. So then the question becomes, what is the reasonable response by employers to materially reduce the risk of exposure in the workplace? And that's a tough question. Reasonableness is, it's not black and white. And so the idea for how this will be enforced is to look to guidance that's out there. And the guidance can be OSHA's guidance, CDC guidance, specific guidance from the state plans in the states where you reside, executive orders from governors and health department guidance that's out there. And so what we have been doing is sort of collecting all of that and building a collection of best practices, a collection of reasonable practices that we expect either because they're ordered by a health department, strongly recommended by OSHA CDC, are part of that bucket of responses that we think would be reasonable and therefore necessary to meet that compliance burden under the Osha Act. And so that's where we start to talk about here is, some of the protections to consider are those actions that we think are in that bucket of actions that OSHA will expect to see, not necessarily all of them, but some combination of them, depending on the risk of exposure of contracting the virus in your workplace. And the first thing we have listed here, and this is not coincidental, but we think the most important thing that every employer should do is to develop and implement a COVID-19 exposure control and response plan. And what we have found when we get involved with a lot of different employers across different industries over the last several months is that they're taking individually a bunch of different actions and issuing lots of communications and doing training and developing standalone protocols for health screening or for what to do when there's a confirmed case or what your decisions are about protective equipment. What we're recommending is that you pull all of that together. If you haven't done any of that, let's get on that and let's put together developing the actual strategies we're going to employ and pull them together in a single comprehensive written exposure control plan. But if you've taken these actions sort of spread around across different procedures and different policies, we are recommending that you pull it all together into a single coherent document. And that's going to serve a lot of important purposes. First of all, Dan talked a little bit about, employees are scared, right? There are employees who are thinking it's dangerous for me to go to work because I don't want to get sick. I'm seeing what's happening at meat packing facilities and, at hospitals and I'm scared. Is my employer taking this seriously? Is my employer doing everything they can to protect me from catching this virus? So having a, single source, comprehensive, thoughtful written exposure control plan is going to be a tool you can put into your employees' hands to show them we're taking this seriously. You can see everything we're doing. A lot of times employees only see that which they can directly feel or directly do, like put on a mask or put on gloves. If they're not doing that, they think you are not doing anything. But if they can see everything you're doing, like enhanced cleaning and protocols for screening for employees who might have the virus and how they're keeping sick employees out, et cetera, they can see all that. That will give them a greater comfort level, and you won't have employees who are refusing to work, who are, the next big issue, complaining to OSHA. We're at the point now where we've seen something around, I want to say 25,000 employee complaints to OSHA or the state OSH plans around the country about their employers' responses to the pandemic, not doing enough, not doing anything. I don't know what they're doing. And, when those complaints go to OSHA, you're going to have to interact with OSHA. Maybe it's an inspection. Maybe it's a letter that asks you to investigate the complaint and respond to OSHA, but you'd like to avoid all that. So having a good written plan will help you avoid that. The next step, like I said, is if those complaints do happen, and they're happening at an extraordinary rate all around the country, is you're going to interact with OSHA. And what's Exhibit A? And the best way to respond to those notifications from OSHA, the best way to respond to an inspection from OSHA, is to have that exposure control plan, single source document that lays out all the actions you've taken, shows how thoughtful you've been about the response to the pandemic, and will allay any concerns that OSHA may have based on an employee complaint, based on, heaven forbid, a case that has to be reported to OSHA because of a death or a hospitalization or something like that. In addition to OSHA, there's departments of health. County and state departments of health now are making contact and going to workplaces, evaluating employers' responses, and they have, in a lot of ways, more authority to shut down a workplace than OSHA does even. And so having a good, thoughtful, single source written control plan is going to be very impactful in demonstrating to the health departments the response you've taken. And then the last really unfortunate reason why this will be a helpful document to have is that there's, I think, a tidal wave of litigation waiting around the corner. There's, obviously going to be people's lives who are impacted by this virus, and they will be looking for entities to bring personal injury and wrongful death lawsuits against. And one of the things that, we're going to see is that employers may be protected under workers' comp for their own employees who contract the illness. But what about all the third parties, especially you all that, bring visitors and guests and customers into your workplaces for tours, for tastings, for, contractors and vendors that come in to deliver and to pick up and for shipping and whatever. And then also family members. One of your employees contracts the illness. He can't sue you because of workers' comp exclusivity, but if he goes home and passes that illness on to a spouse, a child, anyone that they live with, those folks are not barred by workers' comp exclusivity. So there's going to be major litigation out there. And Exhibit A for OSHA, same Exhibit A in the context of any personal injury litigation out there as well, is going to be your exposure control plan. And the better, more thoughtful, more comprehensive that is, the better you will be able to demonstrate you are meeting that reasonable employer level standard. You are meeting CDC and OSHA guidance, you are meeting health department guidance, and you had it all pulled together in one plan. I promise every bullet in this PowerPoint won't get as much discussion as that one, but that's the big one. And now everything else that's on this slide, and really everything that I'm going to talk about over the course of the next few minutes, are the components of the exposure control plan. One of those components is, what is the personal protective equipment or protective equipment that maybe doesn't rise to the level of PPE that you're going to require in the workplace to address this hazard. And that's going to depend on the different tasks that people are performing. If you're doing that pre-work health screening and you got somebody out there taking employee temperatures before they come into the workplace, you're going to think about a pretty heightened level of PPE for them. Mask, face shield, gloves, eye protection, maybe a gown, something like that. Pretty high level because they're interacting with every employee in close contact before they enter the facility, if you're doing that at the workplace. But for others, it might just be, face coverings. There's, by and large, we're going to talk about that in some detail. N95 masks and respirators aren't really being recommended outside the healthcare setting, but face coverings may not be considered PPE, but it's an important tool, and you want to analyze that and make a determination. That hazard assessment can be part of your exposure control plan. Signage and communication for your employees and guests about personal hygiene practices. Talk about what that's going to be in your exposure control plan, develop those, post them around the facility about hygiene practices and about social distancing, and thinking about, these markings on the floor or on the wall or signage overhead that shows, what would be appropriate social distancing. All of that should be thoughtful approach, part of your plan, and implemented out in the field. What are the ways, what are the administrative practices you're going to put in place to identify and require sick employees and guests to stay out of the workplace. Maybe that's requiring them to do some self temperature screening and symptom screening at home. Maybe you're doing it before they enter the workplace. It's going to be things like sick leave policies to encourage employees to notify you if they're experiencing symptoms so they stay out of work. And the more likely, if they're getting paid to not be at work, they're more likely to be honest about symptoms that they're experiencing. And then thinking also about your protocols for what to do when there is close contact, when there is exposure, when there is a positive test, how you isolate, remove those folks from the workplace, and then what you do in the way of housekeeping and sanitation. In the ordinary course, regular routine cleaning of common surfaces, common areas, shared tools, shared equipment, things like that. That's got to be part of your comprehensive exposure control plan. And then what you're going to do for that cleaning and sanitation when you have a confirmed case that is identified at the workplace. Thinking about that in advance, documenting it in a policy or procedure, and putting it in your exposure control plan, great idea. Think about the tools that you're going to need either for that enhanced housekeeping, making sure that you're getting cleaning products that are on the EPA approved list as things that actually will kill the virus, and providing and supplying that along with the alcohol-based hand sanitizer, hand soap cleaning stations, and hand sanitizer stations placed throughout the facility so you can encourage and require good individual personal hygiene. And then a bunch of other ideas and things that we'll talk about here. But the last bullet here really is just a transition to our next slide, which is implementing engineering and administrative controls. And we've already talked about a number of those administrative controls on this slide. On the next slide, Dan, we'll talk about some other ideas that we think make sense for most workplaces. From an engineering standpoint, and these are sort of ranked in terms of most important to least important from OSHA's perspective. This is a historical safety philosophy, is that, not even on this screen, is remove people from the hazard entirely. So to the extent you have employees who can continue teleworking, you should do that to the maximum extent possible. I understand we're actually manufacturing something, and so there needs to be people on site. But if you've got administrative roles that can continue to telework, I would continue as much you can that kind of role. That's perfect removal from the hazard. But below that, the next most important thing you can do is engineering controls. And engineering controls would include things like installing high efficiency air filters into your HVAC system, modifying your HVAC system so that it increases ventilation rate, turnover rate of the air, but also doing things like bringing in supplemental air purification and air movement devices and equipment. Opening doors and windows as much as you can to get good natural airflow, dock doors if you can for that same reason, but then also thinking about other installations like physical barriers, right? I'm sure you've seen this at the grocery store. You've got that plexiglass barrier between you and the point of sale personnel at the grocery store. Well, think about areas at your workplace where that may be necessary. Is there equipment that multiple people need to work on at the same time? We just can't figure out a way to reconfigure it to keep people more than 6 feet apart to perform those tasks. Well, think about whether you could put some sort of plexiglass barrier between those workers to accomplish that. But then also, how about reconfiguring the workplace, the layout of equipment, or the equipment itself that would help facilitate social distancing? We're seeing this in particular in break rooms, in areas where employees might cluster. I've seen a lot of people in their break rooms take break tables down to a table with one chair and then anchoring the chairs to the floor so that people can't move the chairs back together and sit together at a table. I've even seen people put in sort of a crisscross X plexiglass barrier so people can sit at the same table, but they're all sort of protected by a barrier between them. Removing microwaves, removing coffee pots, bringing in instead single serve water bottles and coffee drinks, things like that, so that you don't have people handling the same equipment, the same refrigerator, same microwave over and over again. If that stuff is remaining in place, then you go down to your administrative controls and think about, we're going to have to clean these surfaces a lot, safe work practices and administrative controls. If you're going to keep a common water station, common coffee station, refrigerator, microwave. Make sure you're supplying sanitation wipes, decontamination wipes, and hand sanitizer, and requiring everybody to clean between use, and of course, washing their hands extensively in those circumstances. The administrative controls, we talked about a lot of this already. Some other things to think about are job rotations, staggered shifts, huddles, where people will be working with the same small group of people throughout, so there's less commingling. So if you do have a positive case, contact tracing is easier, and if you have to quarantine individuals, it's a smaller segment of your workplace. But job rotations and staggered shifts are a great way to keep the peak number of employees present at any one time as low as possible. And then staggering start and end time is also a great way to reduce the number of people in those bottleneck areas, right? Your entries and exits coming in and going at the same time, especially if you're trying to do a pre-work screening protocol. If you could stagger start and end times, you won't have long lines of people more likely to have that breakdown in social distancing. Think about ideas like that. And then protective equipment, we're going to talk about that in more detail in a little bit. So let's move on to the next slide. I've spent a lot of time talking about exposure control plans, and that's really what the rest of this section is about, is what does an effective control plan look like. I'll try to move through that quickly since we've already talked about it a little bit. But the idea here is it's a written program like any other written safety and health program. You've got, I assume, a hazard communication program, which is the overarching program to how to train your employees in the hazards of chemicals in the workplace, and how to give them information about those hazards and how to protect them. Lockout tagout program, same thing. This is a safety and health management system related to one specific hazard, and that is the COVID-19 exposure in the workplace. It should be tailored site-specific to your establishment. OSHA loves these things, right? When they see them, it backs down their angst a little bit about what's going on in your workplace, and they're more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. Dan is going to talk to you about the VOSH rulemaking. The VOSH rulemaking is basically going to say that every employer needs to have one of these plans. A bunch of states are already required to do it because of governor's executive orders and things like that. So it is, in addition to being a best practice, very likely to end up being required everywhere in the country. I think it is essentially required to meet that general duty expectation. So we're highly recommending it for everybody. And we know it's an effective tool to communicate to your employees. On the next slide, we get into the individual elements of an exposure control plan, starting with social distancing. This is a term that, I don't think I'd ever really heard before 4 months ago, and now it's everywhere I turn. It's the really critical piece of exposure control, because this is a virus that is transmitted airborne, and it can travel with coughs and sneezes and respiratory secretions. And there is a general sense that 6 feet is more or less a good safe distance, where if I'm talking, if I'm coughing or whatever, you hopefully will be far enough away that there's not enough viral load that you could ingest or get into your the various inlets that can cause the illness for you. So how do you ensure social distancing in the workplace? What's going to be part of your program in regard to social distancing is signage and communication, reinforcing the importance of it, and physically showing employees how to do this in the workplace, marking areas where there tend to be gathering in clusters, entrances and exits and break rooms and workstations, showing where that 6 feet of distance or more, what it would look like, markings on the floor, whether it's just a taped X or you get some, signage out there that, identifies that social distance marking. Consider, hall monitors, probably not the right word for it, but the concept is people whose job it is to just monitor whether social distancing is being adhered to. And this includes for customers and guests that you would bring in to your facilities, as well as your employees. People that are just out there where there is kind of those common areas where there are bottlenecks, and reminding people, encouraging them to keep that distance and pointing out to them if they're breaking that distance. We talked about the engineering control of evaluating equipment, evaluating workstations, and seeing if there's a need or an ability to actually reconfigure equipment, reconfigure the layout of the floor, reconfigure where equipment sits on the floor, and reconfigure individual machines, right? If there's two workstations very near each other, but one of the workstations could be moved to the other side of the machine, the two people could be there at the same time and still be 6 feet apart. Look for those opportunities. If that can't be done, look for opportunities to use barricades and plexiglass shields and things like that. Talked about staggering shifts, breaks, and meal times, things like that to better enhance the ability to maintain social distancing. Reconfiguring your break rooms, as I talked about. If there is, walkways where people, will generally just sort of, be wherever they want in the hallway, think about setting it up. Like maybe you've seen this in the grocery store too, is we're going one way down this aisle, one way down that aisle. So you don't have people crossing in close proximity to each other, even just passing each other in the hallways on the way to the bathroom, whatever. And just think about, look around the workplace. Think about all the areas where individuals might have the opportunity or the need to work or interact in close contact with each other, and see if there's a solution for that. And then from social distancing, we move on to, on the next slide, health screening procedures. This has become very popular. It is in a lot of states and a lot of orders, and Dan will talk about what's happening in Maryland, Virginia, and DC, either required or highly recommended, whether it's something that is being done by the employees themselves before they come to work, or that you as an employer are doing before they enter the workplace. The whole concept here is isolating sick employees, keeping them out of the workplace. So one way to do that is to try to identify and catch an employee who is exhibiting symptoms before they enter the workplace. This is something, taking somebody's body temperature, asking them symptom-based questionnaires or questions that would be, absolutely prohibited under the ADA as, asking invasive medical-based questions of your employees. But because we are in a pandemic and there is a direct threat to the workplace, this virus and employees who may be carriers of the virus are a direct threat to the workplace. We're allowed to do things like that now that we otherwise would not be permitted to do. So you're allowed to do temperature checks. You're allowed to ask questions about symptoms. I think it's a good practice to consider. You want to think about, and let's go to the next slide. I think we get into some of the nitty gritty about where to do it, who to do it. You want to think about, develop a real thoughtful written protocol for how this is going to happen. Give a lot of thought to where and how and who is going to do it. If you can do it by having your employees self-screen at home, and maybe even that means you're going out and you're buying a bunch of oral thermometers and supplying them to your employees to take home with them. So they're taking their own temperatures and reporting to you if they've got an elevated temperature. 100.4 degrees is the benchmark that CDC has set. And then maybe even a set of questions to ask each day, or that they can ask themselves each day about COVID-19 based symptoms they may be experiencing, and report that to you. If you'd rather do it at work, if you don't have confidence you're going to get truthful answers, or the employees are actually going to follow through at home, and you're doing it at work, the way that I found works best, at least in our region here in the Mid-Atlantic, certainly this time of year, is to consider doing it at home. I'm sorry, not at home, doing it in the company parking lot, where the employee doesn't even enter the workplace, even for a minute, to have that area where every employee is going to walk through eventually, where you've had the infected employee present. Have them pull into the parking lot at a table, a tent, a security gate, something like that. Crack the window an inch or two. Use a non-contact thermometer with a temperature taker who's protected by the gown, gloves, eye protection, masks, and face shield. Take the temperature, and ask the questions about symptoms. If they're clear, they go on through, park, and go into the building. If they're not clear, you talk to them about contact tracing. You talk to them about encouraging medical treatment, encouraging getting the test, and then keeping them out of the workplace. If you have to do it at work, you want to do it as close in the building. You do it as close to the entrance as possible, so there's fewer areas where an employee who it turns out has the virus, fewer areas where they've been. and you do it the same way. If you can use a barrier, install a barrier for the temperature taker who can reach around or through an opening to take that temperature screening. That's the other way to do it. Think about from an employment standpoint, do this in a non-discriminatory manner, right? If you're testing everybody. Maintain confidentiality of test results. If you're actually writing down temperatures or actual answers to symptom-based questions, that is a medical record under the ADA. It has to be kept for a year in a confidential manner. If it is, it's possible that you may be creating an employee medical record under the Osha regulations, which would have to be kept for decades. If you are not using a medical professional to do that task, that it is not such a medical record. OSHA has been all over the map on this. That's Eric Kahn's opinion. I'm confident I'm right about that. But if you're not using a medical professional to do the medical screening, to do the temperature screening, it should not be a record that's covered by OSHA. But if it is determined to be such a record, it's required to be kept for the life of employment plus 30 years. Things to think about and things to look at state by state are whether you have to pay employees for time that they spend waiting to be screened, time that they are screening themselves at home, or for the screening process itself under state and federal wage and hour laws. Consider using consent and acknowledgement forms before the screening protocols are implemented. I think that's a very good idea. And then on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some additional kinds of screening, and that is the test itself, COVID-19 testing. We're seeing some employers, as testing becomes more prevalent, make this a condition either to return to work for a business that's reopening, or even some employers, Amazon I think is out there, testing everybody every day before they come into work, or they're soon going to be doing that. So there are opportunities to do that. But if you do that, again, think about the records that you might be collecting, whether those are employee medical records that need to be retained. Beware of false negatives, and a negative test is really a snapshot in time, right? Somebody could be negative today. That doesn't mean they won't contract the illness that night when they go home. So don't rely on, well, I've tested all my employees, they're negative, so we don't need to adopt all these other administrative and engineering controls. It's a useful tool, but it doesn't mean you don't follow the rest of the guidance. One thing that's really interesting happened earlier this week. EEOC issued guidance that said employees may not require their employees to take the antibody test. They can require the active virus test, the swab that you've seen and heard so much about. You're allowed to require that. You're allowed to require it to return to work. If you previously tested positive, you're allowed to make it a condition to come to work if you wanted to, although that's going to strain the ability to maintain staff. But you are not permitted under the ADA to require the antibody test. An interesting distinction, and probably a bad idea by the EEOC, but that's where they are right now. Next slide. Do we get into masks and such here? Oh no, sanitizing and disinfecting. Again, we talked a little bit about this already. Develop a specific schedule, identify the specific materials you're going to use, who's going to use them, and think about, by the way, hazard communication issues. If you're bringing in new kinds of chemical cleaners that are new to your workplace and introduce new hazards to your workplace, remember that that is covered by the HAZCOM standard, and you've got to get the SDS, train employees in that hazard category if it's a new category in the workplace, and make sure that the material or the bottles or containers that contain the material are labeled appropriately. One of the things we have seen is employers get these giant barrels of some cleaning chemical and then take it down from that barrel to individual squirt bottles and cleaning containers that are not labeled, right? Just generic bottles they get, and that's going to be a problem. You have to have a labeled container of a cleaning chemical, any hazardous chemical at the workplace under the hazard communication standard. But identify those areas that require high touch point areas, common areas that are, lots of employees would share that space, and make sure you're cleaning them frequently on a specific defined schedule, as well as on an as needed basis if there's a potential exposure, potential, known contact there. Develop a checklist or log so that you can document the cleaning that is being done in case you're ever challenged on that. And then look out for state and local guidance on when, how, where, and what to use in terms of sanitizing and disinfecting the workplace. On the next slide, requiring employees to wear masks. I'm going to just cover this very briefly because it's really important, but I don't want to get into all the minutia of this. First of all, you are permitted to require employees to wear face coverings. No question about that. This would be like requiring employees to wear closed-toed shoes or long-sleeve shirts, depending on the type of work activity that they may be involved in. These kinds of masks we're talking about, you know, the paper and cloth masks, the do-it-yourself masks, a gaiter, a scarf, a bandana, whatever. It's all really important. But it's not considered personal protective equipment. So you're not covered by OSHA's PPE standard, which means under the PPE standard, you're not required to provide training. You're not required to supply them to the employees. You're not required to pay for them for the employees, but you are permitted to require them. And the reason they're not PPE is that they don't technically provide adequate protection for the wearer of the face covering to protect them from the virus. It is designed more to protect others around the wearer of the face mask from the wearer. If they are infected, it prevents droplets and aerosolized material from getting out and infecting others. But the concept here is my mask protects you, your mask protects me. So masks are, I think, a hugely important piece of any effective exposure control program. So I want to move past the idea of whether you're permitted to require employees to do it and talk about whether you're required to require employees to do it. And Eric Kahn's answer to that question is yes. I think we are at a point now where there is broad enough consensus from recommendations from CDC and OSHA, recommendations or requirements from governor's executive orders and state and local health department orders, and wide enough and broad enough recognition and wide enough and broad enough accessibility and availability, since we're not talking about N95 masks and respirators and face shields and things like that that are hard to come by. Any of these other kinds of cloth and paper face coverings, they're available, widely recommended, widely recognized to be effective. That to me sounds like a feasible and recognized means of abating the hazard that would be required by OSHA's general duty clause. And would be required by the reasonable employer standard in a tort situation, a wrongful death, personal injury situation. So my view is it would be a very hard argument to make that we did not recognize the appropriateness of face coverings in the workplace or believe that they were effective at addressing the hazard in the workplace. So I think we are at the point now where it is essentially a requirement. And it is a requirement, I would say, at least in those circumstances where you cannot ensure social distancing, continuous social distancing. So if you have employees who are working in an enclosed workspace, an office, or a really isolated work area, they could take down a face mask for whatever period of time that they are by themselves in that enclosed area. But if they're going out even just to walk to the bathroom, walk through an area where they might pass somebody even for a moment, I think it's a requirement at this point to have it. There's a difference between close contact, which triggers all kinds of duties, I'll say duties, triggers all sorts of actions under the recommendations from OSHA and CDC. Close contact is breaking that 6-foot social distance for an extended period of time. Whenever you read guidance about face masks, it doesn't talk about close contact, which is both proximity and duration. It only talks about social distancing. If you cannot ensure social distancing at all times, masks are basically required. So even if it is passing in the hallway, momentary discussion, momentary interaction, still, I think, required to have those face masks in those circumstances. Let's move on and see if we can get ahead back to Dan. I think we've covered by and large all of this here. So let's go on to the next slide. I won't go into detail here, but I will say this. If you have employees who request permission to wear something more substantial than a paper or cloth mask, and we're seeing a whole lot of that around the country, you're permitted to allow them to wear that for voluntary use. You're also permitted to require it, but CDC and OSHA are not recommending those N95 respirator masks as a requirement yet, or even recommending it. I think it's so they can preserve them for the healthcare setting, but they're not recommending it. So I'm not recommending that you require that. If you do require respirator masks or respirators more substantial, you have to adopt essentially, an entire respiratory protection program, all sorts of training requirements. It's a big deal. So I would try to avoid it. But you can permit an employee to wear an N95 mask if they wish to do so, and they supply their own. That does trigger some duties under OSHA's respiratory protection standard. Basically, that you look at and think about whether this employee would have serious challenges breathing, that it would be harmful for them to wear an N95 mask. And if it would be, don't permit it. And also you have to provide a copy of OSHA's Appendix D to their respiratory protection standard, really like a one-page document highlighting some of the elements of respiratory protection. Even if you're allowing it just for voluntary use, you have to provide that. I would highly discourage you allowing, even on a voluntary basis, any kind of respirator more substantial than an N95. For example, the half face, elastomeric, the gas chamber, bunker kind of respirator. If you allow that kind of robust respirator, even on a voluntary basis, you will take on most of, maybe even all of, the requirements of OSHA's respiratory protection standards. So be careful about that. On the next slide, other PPE, we've talked about it for your temperature taker, maybe for your housekeeping crew, maybe for individuals who are going to have regular and frequent close contact with the general public. Think about some enhanced PPE beyond just the cloth and paper face coverings, like gloves. I'm not a big proponent of gloves, to be honest, as PPE in this context. That was pretty popular early on, but the reality is, if you're still touching your face, you're just treating it like you're not wearing the gloves. You're still getting virus on the gloves, potentially touching your face, not washing your hands as much. So I generally don't encourage that, except for in the context of the temperature taker and maybe the housekeeping crew. But otherwise, if there are high-risk exposure tasks, point of sale personnel, tour guides maybe, think about something more substantial like the paper and cloth mask in combination with a face shield. And if you're going to things like face shields, like gowns, like gloves that are PPE, then you do have those PPE requirements to supply it and pay for it, training employees in the limitations of its use, how to put it on, how to take it off, and things like that. So we'll move on from there. Responding to confirmed cases. You want to have a plan in place for that panic moment when you find out one of your employees tests positive. Maybe they're right there in the facility. When you learn that information, what are you going to do? Have a good, thoughtful written plan for that. How you're going to isolate them, where you take them to before they're sent home, how you're going to help them get home if they're not able to drive themselves. If they didn't drive themselves to and from work that day anyway. And then how you're going to implement a contact tracing protocol. Remember that if you're out there talking, and you're required to do this, talk to other employees and other individuals who have had close contact with the employee who's tested positive, but you have to maintain the confidentiality of the employee who's tested positive, notifying them about that close contact. And then what are you going to do about, cleaning and disinfecting the workplace and tools and equipment and areas where that sick employee has been the last few days, and that sort of thing. And then on the next slide, we talk about, similarly, you've got a confirmed case. How do you get that employee back to work? I guess I removed that slide, but there are strategies out there, good CDC guidance on when can you let an employee who's gotten the illness and recovered from it come back to work. And there's strategies based on time since they last experienced symptoms, or a test-based strategy, which generally requires 2 negative tests 24 hours apart from 2 different respiratory specimens. So think about all those strategies, build those into an effective plan, and you're going to be in good shape. And if you need help putting that plan together, that's what we've been doing the last 4 months, working with employers to develop custom plans that will protect them from all that exposure and help them keep their employees safe. So thanks so much. I'm sorry I went over a little bit. But I'm going to let Dan do some DC, Maryland, and Virginia local stuff to close out the program.
Thanks, Eric. Yep, we have about 5 or 6 more slides here just to cover the DC, Maryland, and Virginia reopening updates and requirements. I just want to address a question that we got on the webinar chat, and that's about vacation time and your employees going out, taking a vacation and perhaps misbehaving, and to what extent can you require that they quarantine or take a test before coming back. So the issue here is you want to be really careful because there are several states that have off-duty discrimination laws that prohibit discrimination against employees who are doing legal activities. So someone that's going out on vacation and perhaps going to a bar, even if it's in, you know, a hotspot area, is not doing anything illegal. So taking some type of adverse action or requiring them to go through these additional jumps and hurdles to return to work could be deemed discriminatory. So rather than focusing on, you know, a policy against personal travel or misbehaving on personal travel, really this should be more of an education piece, educating your workforce about the virus and strongly encouraging them to avoid traveling to high-risk areas and of course, behaving in a responsible manner for the sake of themselves, but also for your business. So jumping in really quick now to Virginia. And Eric had mentioned earlier the VOSH emergency temporary standard that is on its way. So this was something that was born out of basically lobbying efforts by the Virginia Legal Aid Justice Center and worker advocacy groups in the poultry processing and meat packing plants. Of course, you all probably heard the news stories about the spike in infectious disease, COVID-related issues in these poultry processing and meat packing plants across the country. So these worker advocacy groups went right to the governor and Virginia Osha and said, hey, we need an emergency standard. We need some guidelines. So May 26th of this year, Governor Northam issued an executive order requiring the Virginia Department of Labor and Industries to promulgate an emergency regulation that's going to apply to all workplaces to control, prevent, and mitigate the spread of COVID-19. And this is important. It's happening very fast. The public comments are due this Monday, June 22nd. And 2 days later, a meeting is already set with the Virginia Safety and Health Codes Board, who's going to be promulgating that rule. So expect that to be rolled out pretty fast here. And what is it going to require of you employers in Virginia? Well, a lot of what Eric was just talking about, an exposure control plan. You're going to need a written return to work policy. That's one of the specific requirements in there. And you're going to need to address a lot of the things that we just went over. You want to address PPE, sanitation, access to employee exposure and medical records, and HAZCOM, and the employee notification procedures. So Virginia is going to have regulations that are going to address specifically each one of those items that you see on the screen here. And you want to pay particularly close attention to that and make sure that whatever program you're putting in place lines up with that emergency regulation. So outside of that, where are we in Virginia right now? Well, right now we are in phase 2 of the reopening, and that began in Virginia on June 12th. So about, what is that, a week ago from today. So if you go to the Virginia government website, the Forward Virginia guidelines are listed there, and they have detailed requirements for specific industries, including restaurants and beverage services. And they specifically list wineries, breweries, and distilleries and tasting rooms in that guidance. So it has certain requirements, best practices, additional considerations, and the bullets that you see on the screen here are really the key ones that you should certainly take note of and make sure that you're following. So you want to post signage at the entrance stating that no one with a fever or COVID-19 symptoms or who has had a known exposure to a COVID-19 case in the prior 14 days is allowed entry. Post a sign to provide public health reminders about social distancing, gathering, options for high-risk individuals, and also staying home if you're sick. And then finally, we're allowed to open the indoor tasting rooms in Virginia, as of a week ago, of course, occupancy limited at less than 50% of the low number on your certificate of occupancy. You need to make sure that there's a minimum of 6-foot distance between parties at tables. Deep cleaning and disinfecting of high-touch surfaces, of course, with the EPA certified cleaning supplies. There's going to be no self-service food areas allowed, so areas where you'd have condiments or where members of the public can go gather either food or other items, silverware, etc. Bar seating, congregating areas, game areas, dance floors, if you have those, are going to be closed for patrons except for pass-throughs. So basically, you need to be seated at a table. Employees, of course, need to wear face masks when working and dining in service areas. We went through that in quite a bit of detail, but again, it's required. Your employees need to wear the face mask. To the extent that they have some type of medical issue, that again gets into ADA concerns, and you need to have that conversation with them to see if there's any accommodation that can be made. And then finally, you should be using single disposable menus. Make sure you just have the paper menus that single use provided to patrons at the table, and then it's thrown out. Nothing that can be reused and passed on throughout the day, throughout weeks, should be out there. If there are condiments, etc., that are used, make sure that they're cleaned between each party. Moving on to Maryland. Where are we in Maryland? Well, on May 29th, Governor Hogan issued an executive order specifically allowing breweries, wineries, and distillers to provide service in outdoor seating areas. Since then, however, Maryland transitioned to stage 2 of the roadmap to recovery, and that was again a week ago, June 12th. So you're allowed to open up your tasting rooms, indoor 80% capacity. That is, however, subject to local jurisdiction. So there are some jurisdictions in Maryland that are still technically in phase 1. For example, if you are in Montgomery County, you are still in phase 1. I think that is supposed to be transitioning into phase 2 today at 5 p.m., however, but there was a lag in some jurisdictions where they remained in stage 1 of the roadmap to recovery, whereas other jurisdictions moved into stage 2. I think Montgomery County being one of them, and also Baltimore City. So what are the requirements under that roadmap to recovery for restaurants, bars, breweries, distillers, and wineries? It's very similar to what you saw on the last screen in Virginia. No groups larger than 6 people at all. Tables need to be cleaned, disinfected between each party, and all staff need to be wearing face coverings. Provide single-use disposable menus. Make sure those are thrown out after each party. And then staff providing food service items should wear gloves and wash hands immediately afterwards. That's some guidance that is a little bit different from what you see in Virginia. Nonetheless, that's certainly best practice and something that you should certainly be doing regardless of whether you're in Maryland, Virginia, or DC. Make sure that patrons remain 6 feet apart unless they're from the same household to the extent possible, or in the same party. And then order stations, shared tools, and equipment need to be wiped down after each use. So here's some additional Maryland requirements and some suggestions that is listed in the Roadmap to Recovery guidance. Employees should be trained in and understand the current COVID-19 health and workplace guidelines, such as hand hygiene, cleaning protocols, and proper PPE use and disposal. So to the extent that your employees haven't seen this Roadmap to Recovery and the best practices for businesses to reopen, especially as we transition in phase 2 now, maybe it's a good time to have, a pre-work meeting and make sure you go over all of these guidelines and these requirements with them. And to the extent that you haven't put together a written plan yet, make sure you take a look at that and incorporate those best practices and that guidance into your plan. That would be the best way to go about this, is take that guidance, turn it into a written exposure control plan, and do the training with employees. It's going to be clear what the requirements and expectations are, and everyone's going to be on the same page. And if, God forbid, something does happen, you have a plan in place and you have something to show the Department of Health, OSHA, or whoever might come knocking at your door to ask questions, right? And then one other, or a couple additional best practices that we have here: establish the 6-foot marking system. So again, that goes back to signage. Modify your floor plan to the extent you can to ensure patrons can be seated 6 feet apart. Designate the direction of foot traffic. Service should only be provided when seated at the bar or at the table. So no standing room at all, no service to patrons that are standing or waiting. And if you can, implement a reservation system. It's quite possible with summer, nice weather, that you can become overloaded, and that 50% capacity could start to, you could start to exceed that. And you want to have a plan in place. The easiest way to do that is perhaps a reservation system. And that way people understand that they can't get in unless they have a reservation, or if it is at capacity, it's clear to them why they aren't allowed in, or perhaps how long they might need to wait until they can get in. With the transition to digital marketing and the takeout delivery systems that you've all been implementing over the past 3 months, and perhaps even prior to this, have all caught up to the times. So people understand that there are reservation systems out there. A lot of businesses in the hospitality industry are transitioning to this if they hadn't done so before, such as a lot of breweries, distilleries, wineries. If you want a seat in the tasting room, it may be that you need a reservation now. As simple as that. Finally, moving on to DC. DC is lagging behind a little bit in comparison to Virginia and Maryland. However, it is expected to enter phase 2 this Monday, June 22nd. So what does phase 2 look like for breweries, distilleries, and wineries in DC? So it's very similar, again, to the requirements in Virginia and Maryland. It's going to be outdoor seating, and you are now able to serve indoors at 50% capacity. You're going to be required to have patrons seated in order to be served. So again, no standing room service, no standing at the bar. Practice social distancing, making sure that there's 6 foot between each table. Employees need to wear cloth face coverings and wash hands frequently, and employees are required to wear gloves when handling ready-to-eat food. Patrons should be wearing face coverings while not eating or drinking, so posting signs to that effect and making sure that you're protecting both the patrons but also your employees, that is certainly important. So making sure that you provide some type of signage to remind patrons that they should also be practicing social distance and wear their face masks when they're not eating or drinking. In DC, customers need to provide their name and contact info and record the time of their arrival for contract tracing purposes. So note here that any dining records need to be saved in DC for at least 30 days, and this is something that is unique to DC. Virginia and Maryland does not have this requirement, but DC, make sure you're taking down name and contact information and keeping that for 30 days in your records. You want to be screening employees daily prior to work in DC. So this can be in the form of a symptom questionnaire. And Eric had talked about the screening measures that you can take. Doesn't need to be at the door. Employees can do this on their own, but it is something that is required in DC. You're going to have to make sure that your employees affirm that they've passed the symptom questionnaire, that they don't have a fever over 100.4 or any of the other symptoms. So follow the restaurant, bar, cleaning, sanitation guidance on the DC coronavirus webpage. All of that information is listed there, pretty similar to what you're seeing everywhere. It's very similar to the CDC guidance, making sure that you're using the EPA listed products. You want to be training your employees about COVID-19. Again, this is something that all employers should be doing, and it's important that your employees understand the expectations and the rules going forward. So that's the key part to reopening. Make sure that you have this plan in place and that employees are trained in what's expected and required. provide disposable menus, consider signs regarding COVID-19 and hygiene. Those should be posted throughout the workplace. And then again, consider staggering shifts and break times. And this is all guidance provided in the DC, Virginia, Maryland reopening guidance, the phase 2 requirements. As we get into phase 3, which we don't know when that might be, this might be looking a lot different. A lot of these might go away. But for the time being, as we enter phase 2, we're either 1 week in Virginia or Maryland, or just starting in DC. These requirements are likely here to stay for a while, put it that way. So make sure that you're taking a look at that guidance listed on their websites for further information, and that you're complying with it. And then one other note here, this is the last slide, is you should consider looking into temporary permits for outdoor seating. There's a lot of different ways that you can expand your capacity in your business by getting one of these temporary permits, and it's usually by local jurisdiction. They're very flexible right now because they want business to reopen. It's important to their local economy. So a lot of restaurant, bars, distilleries, and wineries are applying for these temporary permits to extend outdoor seating. It can be extended in parking lots and sometimes even in public spaces. So that's something that you should certainly look into, and to the extent that you're permitted to perform delivery, make sure you keep doing so. Maintain that online ordering system for pickup. Like I said, the rise in digital marketing and ordering from your phone, the tap of your fingers, that certainly triggered a new business model, something that breweries, distillers, and wineries weren't traditionally used to, but that model is likely here to stay, at least for a while. But the good news is you have 2 bites at the apple now, especially with things opening back up, outdoor seating and indoor seating, and you are also still allowed to perform deliveries and the takeout online model. So with that being said, turn it over to Eric really quick and he'll wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, and sorry for taking so much of your time today, folks. But there's so much detail here, and frankly, it's changing constantly, and we're working hard to keep up and giving you current information. And one of the best ways to keep track of all that is, certainly going around all those different websites, health department websites, OSHA and CDC, or we are pulling together resources on our website at conmosiel.com. We have our COVID-19 task force page, where we've got a set of FAQs that's now, I think, like 100 pages long, but it's sortable, indexed, and you can check out the latest FAQs on COVID-19 issues in the workplace. We've got a really, really helpful tool. We didn't get in at all to record keeping and reporting COVID-19 cases. We talked about that with this group the last time we were together, but since then we've put together a really interesting resource, a flow chart for reporting, making reporting decisions, flow chart for making recordable recording decisions, a work relatedness questionnaire if you're trying to assess whether one of your employees' infections is work related and therefore recordable or reportable, as well as a how to record, and then a bunch of articles, a bunch of other webinars and access to information that we've been putting together. So definitely check that out. And then of course we've got our, on the next slide, I guess our blogs, the OSHA Defense Report and the Employer Defense Report. It is just, we used to think if we were putting a couple articles a month, we had a nice current fresh blog, and now it's like, it seems like daily. So check that out for really good content on COVID-19 issues on the labor and employment side or on the OSHA side. And then we've got a webinar series that free monthly webinars on all kinds of different labor and employment issues. And then on the next slide on OSHA issues, that we've adjusted this somewhat so that we're covering COVID issues as they're developing, but a lot of it, turned out to be really timely. We talked about PPE yesterday, and half of it we just talked about COVID PPE issues. And otherwise, next month our program is on the general duty clause, which will surely have a heavy focus on OSHA's enforcement of COVID-19 issues under the general duty clause. So join us for those. They're free, and you can sign up for all of them, and even if you don't come, you'll get a copy of slides and recordings and stuff like that. We've addressed questions as they've come in today. If you have any others, let us know. Type them into the chat box, or here's our contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Hopefully you can tell from the enthusiasm of our discussion today, we're big OSHA and employment law nerds. We love talking about it, and we'd love to be a resource to you anytime, especially your industry. It's been really exciting to develop the new relationship that we have with our spirits and brewery and winery leaders in our community here. And we're here for you, and we're glad that you've been there for us through this difficult time as well. So thanks for joining us, and anytime you need us, don't hesitate to reach out.